So welcome to the third talk in our series with the IMarEST Ocean Governance Special Interest Group. This slot is scheduled for 1 hour, with the talk lasting approximately 40 minutes with questions. If you haven't already got Slido open, then please do. The code is spatial, and I will be fielding questions at the end. If we don't get through them all, we will answer these afterwards and circulate with the link to the video in an email. On to today's talk. Our speaker today is Rachel Mulholland. She is a Senior Marine Advisor at the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science at Cefas, within the Science for Sustainable Marine Management team. She provides advice to the UK government, regulators and statutory nature conservation bodies on the potential risks and impacts of the marine environment on a wide range of human activities in the context of marine spatial planning. Rachel has been working on the development and implementation of marine planning policy in Wales, in particular on land-sea interactions, cross-border and transboundary considerations. She has a background in environmental law and has previously worked in terrestrial planning with the experience of land-sea planning and management interactions. Rachel is presenting today on an introduction to marine spatial planning and integrated coastal zone management. So over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Gemma. So yes, as Gemma says, I will be doing an introduction on marine spatial planning and integrated coastal zone management and looking at why they are important. This talk will focus on the UK in terms of legislation and plan development. So I will cover why marine planning is important and why we need it, how to plan for the marine environment, the legislative basis for marine planning in the UK, the plan development process, and then finally I will touch on integrated coastal zone management and the intricacies of planning at the land-sea interface. So why do we need marine planning? There are many competing societal resource needs in the marine area, including the need for food, energy, trade, transport and tourism, as well as other more abstract needs, such as health, well-being and nature conservation, which the marine environment can contribute to. Globally, the population is increasing rapidly. Many countries individually are dealing with crises in population numbers and are under pressure to increase things like food and energy production, and they are increasingly looking to their marine areas in order to do this. More than 50% of people worldwide live on the coast or in coastal communities. The sea is integral to their way of lives. It provides employment, it provides income and food, as well as having a historical and cultural importance. Planning effectively for these areas is also important for the future safeguarding of these communities, such as coastal defences and flood and erosion risk management. In many countries, the marine area is also a significant contributor to their economy, making up a large proportion of GDP and supporting countless jobs. There are also nature conservation reasons for properly and sustainably managing the marine environment, and the intrinsic value of marine fauna to society, as well as the many reasons in itself to promote nature conservation. It's also important for protection of the tourism and recreation industries and is essential to ensure ongoing future availability of marine resources to meet society's needs. So how do you go about planning for the marine environment? All of these societal resource needs will take up space in the marine environment. Some sectors will need to be located where the relevant resources are available. A port, for example, can obviously only be located at the coast where the infrastructure allows for it to be located. Aggregate extraction can only happen where the relevant aggregates are present. Some sectors or activities will need permanent structures in the marine environment, such as oil and gas or renewable energy installations, whereas others, such as fishing, are more transient and will move through an area. Then there is the duration of the activity to consider. An oil or gas terminal or a wind turbine will be a long-term structure. likely to be in place for decades. Aquaculture, on the other hand, will be a much more short-term and more movable installation. The marine area is also a three-dimensional space. This makes it more complicated to plan for the marine environment as opposed to on land. Some sectors will require use of the sea floor, such as cabling lying under the sea floor, whereas others, like shipping, only require the surface. And some sectors, such as fisheries, can require multiple parts of the marine environment, like the sea floor and the water column and the sea surface. This table on this slide shows the permanence or transience of some of the marine sectors, as well as the marine space that they occupy and whether or not they are resource driven. The country and marine area that you're looking at is important too. Different countries or regions have different priorities and will therefore place higher weight on key sectors compared to others. Some smaller island states, such as in the Pacific or in the Caribbean, are heavily reliant on tourism or on fishing to provide their income and food security. And so these states will prioritize the protection of those resources and those sectors over perhaps new energy exploration within their area. So managing all of these competing demands and competing kind of governmental priorities can be difficult, especially with the increased reliance on the oceans to provide for more of our societal resource needs. Some sectors can coexist, such as those that are transient or do not sterilize a resource, whereas others are not compatible with each other. This coexistence could be spatial, where sectors can operate together using the same space at the same time, or temporal, where sectors can use the same space, but at different times from each other. You also have to consider which species and habitats are of particular importance, where they are within the marine area, and which activities they are sensitive to. All of these things have to be taken into consideration when planning for marine space. There are many different activities which can overlap or share space in the marine area. And you can start to build up a quite complicated diagram of all of the different activities and all of the possible linkages between them. Spatially, for example, there are lots of activities that can take place in a marine protected area. Tourism, fisheries, depending on the type of fishing, shipping, and potentially subsea cabling. It will all depend on the type of activity and its impacts, and also on the features for which that area is protected and what the sensitivities of that protected feature are. For example, if an area is protected for a sedimentary or seafloor feature, then many water column and sea surface activities can continue without having any impact on that protected feature. Temporally, things like shipping, dredging, fisheries, tourism are all very short-term activities. So there is a lot of opportunity for these to share space and coexist. There are also some more complicated linkages where activities can coexist, but over a longer time frame or with some restrictions. For example, in the timing of activities. So aggregate dredging could coexist with cabling, providing the dredging takes place first. The same potentially with aggregate dredging and the construction of energy installations. Marine planning also requires consideration of the interactions between the economy, society, and the environment. The overriding objective of marine planning is the sustainable use and development of marine resources. So the environment is made up of all of the biotic and abiotic elements that combine to make a biodiverse ecosystem. So this includes air, water, sediments, plants, animals, or collectively what we call the natural capital of the system. Society includes safeguarding culture, health, well-being, amenity, and community. Economy relates to the direct and indirect economic benefits that can come from the marine environment and how they are used. For example, jobs, trade, food, transport, and tourism related to the marine area. So society places value on these different aspects, the environment and the economy, but then undertaking marine activities creates risk in return to the marine environment. So these environmental, social, and economic interactions need to be considered in marine planning, but also in the context of prevailing and changed conditions, for example, adaptation to climate change. And it's also essential to understand the effectiveness of the current regulatory and policy framework for each of these elements to determine if and how changes to management could be made, including relationships between land and sea as well. So this can be achieved by applying ecosystem-based management principles to marine planning, which includes high-level ideas such as using appropriate spatial and temporal scales in your planning, using the best available scientific knowledge, acknowledging that there is uncertainty and then managing that scientific uncertainty, undertaking appropriate monitoring, using adaptive management such as deploy and monitor techniques to fill evidence gaps and allow for the de-risking of decision making, and encouraging relevant stakeholder involvement in the process. So what is the legislative basis for marine planning? Marine planning is actually required by law at a European level as well as at a UK level. This slide here shows the steps in the legislation from the EU directive at the top down to UK legislation, the marine policy statement, and finally to the individual marine plans for each administration within the UK. At each level, it gets more detailed and more targeted. Starting at the European level, the EU in 2014 introduced the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, which places a responsibility on all member states within the European Union to introduce marine planning for their marine areas. The deadline for member states to have a marine plan in place is March next year. The idea behind this directive and the reasons given for the development of marine planning were to reduce conflicts between competing sectors and facilitate collaboration and coexistence between different activities, to encourage investment in marine industries throughout the EU by reducing uncertainty in the determination of marine consenting and licensing, and thereby creating predictability and transparency in the process, to facilitate increased cross-border cooperation between states or large transboundary sector developments such as energy grids, transnational cable routes, as well as a joined-up approach to protecting marine species to provide a Europe-wide network of protected areas rather than a series of sporadic national designations. And finally, to protect the environment through large-scale strategic sustainable management. In the UK, the Marine and Coastal Access Act fulfills the UK's obligations under the EU MSP directive. It does actually predate the EU directive, though, by 5 years. So the UK has already been in the process of creating a system of marine plans and planning policy for over 10 years now. This Act committed all UK administrations to an ambitious approach to managing our marine environment, including establishing a network of marine conservation zones, the third tranche of which was designated by the UK government last summer, taking the number of conservation zones in UK waters to just over 90, and meaning that 25% of UK waters now has some kind of designation status. It also committed UK administrations to a system of marine planning, whereby all administrations were to develop and adopt a marine plan for their marine area. This Act also included provisions for reform of inshore fisheries management, the streamlining of marine licensing, and the establishment of the Marine Management Organisation for overseeing the marine planning process within England, and other aspects of marine policy and management. The UK Marine Policy Statement, built on the requirements of the Marine and Coastal Access Act, it set out the framework for preparing marine plans and taking decisions affecting the marine environment and high-level policy context within which each UK administration is to develop their plan. So it laid out the UK government high-level policy objectives that will contribute to the achievement of sustainable development in the whole of the UK's marine area. The Marine Policy Statement also gives additional detail to requirements of UK administrations to deliver marine planning, and this includes a responsibility for cross-border cooperation and plan compatibility in estuary border areas between the administrations, which extends to the sharing of data and coordination of planning activities and timing of plan development, and also responsibilities for ensuring integration between marine and terrestrial planning regimes, effectively moving towards integrated coastal zone management. This marine policy statement included 5 high-level marine objectives. All marine plans within the UK must ensure that marine resources are used in a sustainable way and are in line with these high-level marine objectives. And as a result, that they promote sustainable economic development, they enable the UK's move towards a low-carbon economy in order to mitigate the causes of climate change and ocean acidification and adapt to their effects. They ensure a sustainable marine environment which promotes healthy, functioning marine ecosystems and protects marine habitats, species, and our heritage assets. And finally, that they contribute to the societal benefits of the marine area, including the sustainable use of marine resources to address local, social, and economic issues. So moving on to the plan development process, a plan is only ever going to be useful if it is used. So the development process is especially important to get right. It needs input from different users, regulators, developers, and individuals to ensure an accepted and rounded process. It should set out from the start what the process is for developing the plan, which stakeholders will be involved, and at which stages. You need to encourage appropriate stakeholder engagement to ensure that there is buy-in to the process and the final result from all areas. So industry, local communities, small businesses, environmental NGOs, etc. The process can also benefit from the input of local and industry knowledge to make the plan more robust. The plan should be based within the setting of and with an understanding of the current environmental, social, and economic situation and relevant issues to the area, as well as where it will sit in the current suite of regulation. It can consolidate existing legislation and it can streamline licensing processes, but it should add value to existing management and policy. It should not just add another layer of management for no good reason. Policies should be developed which cover every relevant sector to the country in question, as well as for social, economic, and environmental considerations. These policies should align with that country and that government's priorities for those sectors and for any other wider environmental, social, or economic priorities. They should also be clear, understandable, and have a distinct purpose for being in that plan. The draft marine plan should then be consulted on through a statutory consultation process, which allows all stakeholders to have their say on the plan and the planning process that's being used, as well as have an input, be able to input any additional evidence that they have, which could be relevant to the plan or the policy development. The plan is then adapted by the authority to address any issues raised or new evidence submitted during the consultation phases before publication and adoption of the final plan. Alongside the development of the plan, additional documentation should also be produced. So this includes things like a monitoring and evaluation framework, which will set out how you're going to go about evaluating the success or failure and effectiveness of your plan and your plan policies, and implementation guidance to assist users of the plan and regulators with enacting and following the policies in there. So once a marine plan is put in place, how does it actually have any effect? How does it change anything in the decision-making process? In the UK, this is through the Marine and Coastal Access Act, which places duties on public authorities making any decisions that affect the marine area. These are split into two types of decisions. So Section 58.1 decisions and Section 58.2 decisions, which are not very catchy names there, but there's an important distinction for decision makers. Section 58.1 decisions are any authorization or enforcement decisions. So decisions on approving a development or activity to take place. These decisions have to be made in full accordance with the relevant marine plan for the area in question, in accordance with any policies and objectives within that plan. If it is not made in accordance with the marine plan, the determining authority must state their reasons for deviating from the marine plan. And this is going to be a very narrow scope of potential relevant considerations. So relevant considerations in this case could include wider government policy, if that is in contradiction to the policy of the plan, new evidence which was not available at the time of plan development, previous planning appeal decisions, or any principles of case law that have been held through the courts since the plan has been adopted. Section 58.2 decisions then are any other decisions that could affect the marine area, but which fall outside of the definition of the Section 58.1 decisions. So they're not specifically authorization or enforcement decisions. This could be a decision on fisheries management or even funding decisions for marine sectors. For these types of decisions, the authority making that decision has to have regard to the relevant marine plan, which is not as strict as the Section 58.1 requirement. In addition to these responsibilities, marine plans, when being drafted, have to have regard to any existing marine plans of relevance, such as those in a neighbouring jurisdiction. In reality, the plan has effect through decisions made by public authorities. Public authority is quite a wide definition and includes a whole range of organisations, local authorities, government departments, or any body that undertakes any statutory duties. So the types of decisions that fall under the definitions of the Marine and Coastal Access Act include any decisions with the potential to impact the marine environment. This can include the obvious decisions on marine management, consenting and permitting of developments, but it can also include more indirect decisions, such as policy making in other areas, like setting renewable energy targets or the designation of new nature conservation areas. Can also include decisions on fisheries management, such as setting or altering maximum sustainable yield, or fishing quotas for different fish species, all of which will impact the marine environment. And then decisions that you might not immediately link to the marine environment can also be relevant. For example, decisions on large development projects on land, which include a provision for using locally sourced aggregates, which could lead to increased demand for marine aggregates in that area. Or a local authority increasing or decreasing funding for tourism within their county, which could lead to changes in marine tourism demand. This highlights another aspect of marine planning, which is that it doesn't just relate to decisions made in the marine environment. Decisions made on terrestrial activities can have the potential to impact on the marine area. For example, coastal flood defences could affect sedimentation in the local area. Farm development along a river could lead to increased nutrient input into the sea. And therefore, the marine plan and marine policy and objectives will have to be considerations in making those decisions. So there are several different types of marine plan that a country can choose to take forward. These range from large-scale international transboundary or sea basin type plans, some examples of which are the Integrated Management Plan for the North Sea, which was published in Norway in 2015. Instead of covering their whole marine area with one plan, they have planned for the North Sea area separately in recognition that it has different features and different activities to its other marine areas, which require potentially different management approaches. So this method separates the marine area by more ecological boundaries rather than legislative ones. Similarly, the Baltic Sea countries coordinated in the development of their marine plans and agreed a timetable for adoption of their plans and joint consultations. So although the different countries have their individual marine plans and fulfill their regulatory responsibilities in this way, the planning for the whole Baltic Sea area is more coordinated and aligned than if each country went through the process fully independently. That level of plan is quite rare. The next level and much more common level is national marine plans, such as those adopted by the Scottish and Welsh authorities. The Scottish Marine Plan has been in place since 2015, and the Welsh Marine Plan was published in November last year. This is where there is one marine plan to cover the whole of that country's marine area. This generally works best where the marine area is not too large or is not fragmented into many different areas. So the next level down then is regional plans. This is the approach that has been taken forward in England that you can see from this map here. The marine area has been split into 6 different regions in England: the northeast, southeast, northwest, southwest, the east and the south. And for each of these regions, there is an inshore and an offshore plan area. There is a marine plan for each area within each of those regions. The East Marine Plan and the South Marine Plan have both been adopted, and the plans for the remaining 4 regions are being developed at the moment simultaneously with the aim of adoption by the end of this year. Another level down from this is subnational or local level plans, which are usually developed after the national plan is in place. These are usually for areas which have particular additional considerations in terms of management due to maybe concentrations of activities, developments or social considerations. For example, estuary areas may have particular management considerations, busy bays or port areas, or cross-border areas with neighbouring countries, or just areas with large amounts of nature protection or coastal significance. Scotland has begun to develop a system of subnational planning to sit under their national marine plan. The areas are based on more ecological boundaries using physical characteristics to delineate rather than legislative boundaries or distances from shore. They're also being developed by planning partnerships, which allows more local ownership and decision-making about specific issues within the area, which is something that you are able to do more with subnational level plans than with national level plans. Within these different levels of marine plans, there are also different planning approaches that can be taken. So from a very high-level policy approach, where the plan might set out support for certain sectors or to protect against environmental or social impacts, down to a very specific zoning approach that can be taken where the whole marine area can be mapped out with specific spatial allocations for each sector or activity, where certain things can then be allowed to happen and certain things cannot be allowed to happen within very distinct allocated areas. This really is a spectrum, and marine plans can fall somewhere in between. Most marine plans fall somewhere in the middle and are framed around the high-level policies, but with some form of spatial restrictions or spatial allocation for sectors. A lot of evidence and high certainty in your data is required to take a very detailed zoning approach for marine planning. This is the approach that is taken in terrestrial planning with local authority development plans, whereby they will designate areas within their plan for, say, residential housing development or commercial development, and will also categorize areas as being completely unacceptable for certain types of development. This is easier to do on land as we know what is there with more certainty, and it is less of a three-dimensional space to manage than the marine area and less changeable over the short term as well. The planning system on land is also a lot more embedded, having been in place for over 100 years already. So marine planning really is the newcomer to that kind of spatial planning. So spatially planning for a marine area involves thinking about which sectors need or want which parts of the marine area and identifying where there is an overlap. Where an overlap exists, you need to consider whether these sector activities can coexist. If they can coexist, then you need to think about managing this coexistence. Is it spatial or is it temporal coexistence? Does one use the seabed and the other use the sea surface? Is one sector constrained by seasons or by weather? And then if they cannot coexist, or if there are constraints to their coexistence, that is where you would start to input the wider strategic thinking around which sectors have priority. This will depend on the specific location of the overlap. For example, if it is in a tourism hotspot, then tourism could be given a weighted priority over other sectors in that location. But even in the adjacent bay, there could be a similar conflict in which the other sector takes priority. This could also vary at different times of the year. So for example, during different dates of certain fishing seasons, the fisheries sector could take priority, but during the rest of the year, other sectors could take priority in that same location. This kind of planning requires up-to-date, accurate evidence on sectors, resource availability, ease of access, quality of resource, as well as the kind of socioeconomic and environmental constraints to each sector. An example of this type of planning is in Wales, where they have been developing strategic spatial planning through identifying the key strategic areas of sector importance for each sector, which is where this map here is from. Spatial evidence, which is required for marine planning, is very varied. You need to have a broad knowledge of social, economic, environmental, and sectoral factors which are relevant for the space that you are trying to manage. Here, taking biodiversity as an example, you first need to know what species and habitats are important for your coastal and marine area, and you need to know where they are. This can be difficult as you can't easily see into the marine area, but also as animals move around. Some marine species migrate over huge distances and might only be within your waters for a small period of the year. They might also be particularly vulnerable during certain times, such as breeding seasons, so some areas may be more important to protect than others. You need to know the current status as well of each species and habitat. Are they endangered or threatened and therefore in need of more protection? You also need to know the predicted future trends. Is the population declining, recovering, or is it stable? Is the trend that they are moving northwards into new areas as the sea temperatures are rising? In order to effectively manage around these species and habitats, you need to know what their sensitivities are. What are the threats to them from human activities? If you are trying to protect a coral reef habitat, for example, then they will be sensitive to bottom damaging activities like trawl fishing and the sighting of permanent structures on the seabed, but they might also be sensitive to smothering from aggregate disturbance many miles away, depending on the direction of water movement. if you are trying to protect a species such as whales, dolphins, or harbour porpoise, then they are sensitive to underwater noise, which can disrupt their communication and foraging. And this would have to be a consideration in marine construction. The more accurate information and evidence you have on each species and habitat, their locations and their sensitivities, the better you will be able to manage them and take account of them in your planning and in your decision making. So it's the same process then for the human activities that you'll be managing with your marine plan. You need to know which activities are currently operating in your marine area, where they are, and how they are managed. So you want to know the current and future trends for each of these activities. For example, in the UK, aquaculture and offshore wind are growing sectors, whereas oil and gas is generally a shrinking sector. This will help you to calculate which activities are likely to require additional space in the next decade or so within your planning process and which will not. You need to know also what resources each sector relies on and where these resources are. Aggregate dredging requires the right aggregates in an accessible location. So if you know where those aggregate resources are located, then you know where that sector is going to want to operate. Similarly, offshore wind requires the right prevailing wind conditions within a certain water depth range, the right substrate to build on with considerations of cable connectivity, like ease of construction and distance to shore, suitable onshore connection sites. So if you have accurate data on all of these topics, then you will be able to work out where the preferred areas for offshore wind farms are going to be, and then you can plan that into your planning process. You can plan around that knowledge. You can also use this information and evidence to assess the opportunities for coexistence between activities on a much more local and individual level, so much more accurately at that small scale. So to quickly touch then on integrated coastal zone management before I finish. Why is it particularly important to ensure proper management of the coastal zone over and above the rest of the marine area? Coastal zones tend to be very busy places within the marine area with higher concentrations of both developments and activities. They can be environmentally complex and they can be environmentally sensitive areas with a large range of habitats in a very small area. So marine and freshwater aspects, land, sea and intertidal areas. There is also an increased importance of the consideration of impacts on coastal communities from the coastal zone, as a large number of people live in these areas and depend on the coast and marine links for their livelihoods, as well as for health and well-being benefits. Developments and activities in the coastal zone, therefore, arguably, have a greater potential to impact communities than at-sea developments or activities. Marine ecosystems, fish, water quality, and other resources and issues do not adhere to marine plan boundaries, and they do not stop at the coast. Pollution and litter, which originates on land, can run off into the sea. Marine animals migrate between the ocean and river systems. You can't stop at the boundary to try and protect a species if the species doesn't stop at the boundary as well. The coastal zone also marks the convergence of boundaries and planning regimes with overlap in the marine and terrestrial planning areas within the coastal zone. Developments such as piers and ports straddle this zone with aspects of development on land and in the sea. So it is therefore important to take a joined up ecosystem approach to planning within the coastal zone. Integrated coastal zone management is what we apply then to ensure a holistic approach to decision making and management in coastal areas is undertaken. So including consideration of both marine and terrestrial activities and impacts. Integrated coastal zone management provides coordination between the many sectors and policies that lie within and affect coastal areas, applying ecosystem-based management in a coastal context aims to facilitate a unified, cohesive management between the different regimes. So you've got local, regional, national, and international planning regimes all converging in that area, and planning and management authorities which converge at the land-sea interface. And these authorities and regimes often have overlapping physical areas in the coastal zone, as well as overlapping legal obligations and responsibilities. This diagram gives a bit of an example of some of the many organisations and regulations within the UK that have overlapping jurisdictions and responsibilities at the coast, showing just how complicated and multifaceted this type of management can be. So the key priority or overall aim then of integrated coastal zone management is to facilitate joined up management across all of these different authorities and regimes. So we can manage the coastal zone as effectively as we can, essentially pushing all of the different authorities to work together for better, more strategic management of the environment. So that was a quick introduction, a quick run through marine spatial planning and integrated coastal zone management. Thanks for listening. I'll pass back to Gemma.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Very interesting and useful, and it stimulated quite a few questions.
Cool.
So the first question that I'll quickly answer because it's a generic one. Someone's asked if the presentation will be available afterwards. Yes, it will. IMarEST will send out an email this week or next week with the links on so people can view it. So whoever is registered will get that email. So on to the questions. So the first one, Rachel, are marine plans constructed to take account of disruptive events such as oil spills or unexploded ordnance whose occurrence undermines the plan's objectives?
From what I know from the plans that I have worked on, they wouldn't necessarily mention things like unexploded ordnance directly, but they would have policies that would be relevant to that. So for example, policies on underwater noise or policies on preventing pollution or policies on building in pollution safeguards. So they would have those kind of policies in, but they wouldn't, just because of the sheer number of activities that there could be and the sheer number of incidents of different kinds, they can't viably list every potential one, but they would have policies that would be relevant to those occasions. So for example, the underwater noise control.
Okay, thank you. And how difficult is it for marine spatial planners to manage defence activities who by their nature may happen unplanned and whose nature is classified?
Yes, so defence is, that has a bit of that sits above them really. So defence, especially in the UK where marine planning is devolved to the separate administrations, but defence activities are retained at UK government level. So defence activities are, yes, considered a little bit different there because obviously they can, their remit is the protection of the country, and that might sometimes go against the plan. But yeah, it is difficult. In their general everyday activities, they would align with the plan, but then there are going to be those occasions where they might not be expected to, and they technically sit apart from the plan.
Okay, don't worry, I won't probe too much further on that one. In a similar vein, how do national planners manage marine scientific research requests from other states? So these are requests under UNCLOS, whose approval is a UK activity. So it's from the Marine Policy Unit in the FCO as opposed to kind of regional or national planners.
Yeah, I don't think that would necessarily be for the marine planners because they would be bringing in and enacting and implementing the policy. So the policy is formulated based on evidence. So there's obviously the link there, but they would be more enacting and implementing the policy rather than, from my own experience, feeding into the evidence on a kind of day-to-day basis. I'm not sure I'd be the best person to answer that question.
No, that's fine. Thank you. So in terms of the spatial boundaries of plans, you mentioned that some countries like Scotland and Wales kind of do their entire area as one, but England have taken a different approach and separated it out. How were those boundaries defined, do you know, for England? Was it more ecological, or, because you mentioned ecological, or was it more socioeconomic?
I don't know how the boundaries for England were defined. I know that the inshore and offshore areas are based on kind of set definitions of what counts as inshore, offshore, so the 12 nautical mile boundary, but I don't know how they differentiated. I believe that the point on land where the marine areas diverge is a county boundary.
Okay.
So rather than come in the middle of a county with two different regions. So I believe that, but apart from that,
okay,
don't
quote
sorry.
you on it.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got two questions that are quite similar. So in your experience, how do planners manage different priorities between planners that have the shared boundaries? And the second question has made it a bit more specific. So how are plans coordinated within the UK? So does Wales talk to England on cross-border issues, or is it just the MMO that coordinates the planning?
Yeah, administrations do talk to each other. They talk to each other quite a lot. So the 6 administrations within the UK, which is all of the UK administrations plus Republic of Ireland and the Isle of Man. So they discuss planning issues regularly. So they have a 6 administrations group that meets regularly and discusses these things. They send notifications. It's kind of a bit of a soft approach, like kind of agreements. They send notifications of consultations, of changes to planning frameworks, dates of things, and they will all feed into each other's consultation processes there. So they will read it and submit questions or have meetings over the content of plans, and will approach each other on cross-border issues, such as policies that are being brought in an estuary, things like that. So the communication between the administrations is very good, and they do work together there. What was the first part of that question?
You've answered it, don't worry.
Oh, okay.
They were both about transboundary and how the different administrations talk to each other. So.
Okay. Specific issues then. So if an application comes in within the estuary area or near or with impacts that are likely to extend across the border, then the different determining authorities have a responsibility to consult their counterparts on the other side of the border as well. So they will officially consult them on any individual applications that are relevant as well.
Okay, thank you. So in your opinion, what do you see as the next steps for marine planning? Are there any lessons learned that we need to develop in kind of the next round of plans, or do we need something in addition to the plans?
I think that my personal opinion, that what will become more important in the next round of marine plans is social considerations and kind of the social issues and integration at the coast. There more consideration of that, and also moving on to consider enhancement, so environmental enhancement or kind of net gain rather than just kind of mitigating for impact. So not that will necessarily become a requirement on developers, but just that will be more, that will be looked into more within the marine plans, and there will be more scope for including enhancement, and it will make it easier to include aspects of enhancement if that's what you want to do. That's where I believe it's going.
Thank you. No, it's really useful. How do you, and I think by you they probably mean the plans, allow for transient fish or whale species?
How do they allow for it?
Yeah.
So the the protection of those species will not necessarily just be controlled by the plan. So that would be through separate protected areas, which either can put in place strict areas of protection for important breeding areas or spawning areas for fish or mammals, or they can have protected areas for highly mobile species, which may be kind of migration corridors. And some species are just blanket protected anyway, so they're wherever they are, they're protected. In terms of protecting them through the plan will have policies to prevent harm to species from noise impacts, which will apply throughout the marine area. So the developer will have to consider how they are going to follow that policy, so how they're going to prevent any noise impacts or detrimental impacts under any other policy on that species, or the kind of fish spawning area. So that will be throughout the entire plan area. So that would help with mobile species.
Okay, thank you. And you've just touched on noise, and it might be that you feel this, you've answered this question, but I'm going to ask it because it's there. Can you say something about construction noise offshore, such as driving of piles, and also the effect of geophysical surveys?
Okay, so noise is split into two different types of noise. So you've got impulsive noise, which is your pile driving and your surveys, and then you've got just kind of general noise, which is shipping noise or kind of background noise into the marine environment. Both of which are kind of important, but the one that is more controlled through marine planning is the impulsive noise, so from pile driving for construction of wind farms. And that is it's managed in several different ways in different places. So I don't really want to say whether I think there's a right or wrong way to manage it. But the plan, no marine plans will specify exactly how you have to manage the noise. It just places a responsibility on them to manage the noise in a way that will not have a significant adverse effect on any species that are sensitive to noise. So it will be for the developer to assess which species are in the area of the development and whether they're likely to be affected. And if they are, it's their responsibility then to either reduce or minimize or mitigate for that impact, which can be through amping up the noise. It can be through timing restrictions, or it can be through mitigation measures like bubble curtains or things like that to reduce it to a level where it won't impact them. So,
thank you.
Okay.
Going back a bit to boundaries now, the marine plans are about marine space, but as you've noted, there are many interactions with the land. How far inland do you need to consider in the plans for ICZM?
So the marine plan boundary technically goes up to the mean high water mark, which can extend quite far up a river or up an estuary. So for example, one that I know about is in the River Severn, so the Severn estuary, which the marine plan boundary technically extends up to Gloucester Weir, which is miles inland, because that's where the highest tidal mark is. And then the terrestrial planning regime boundary is the low water tide mark. So there is that actual overlap where you would have to consider both regimes, but the wording within the Marine and Coastal Access Act and within marine plans is that any activity which is likely or could potentially have an impact on the marine area has to consider the marine plan and marine planning policy. So there is no hard and fast line where you no longer have to consider the marine plan, or you have to consider it if it's here. You have to make the assessment as to whether the activity or the development has the potential to impact on the marine area. So that could be miles and miles inland with the potential to increase nutrient runoff into a river, or it could be up on the top of a cliff, but it could have the potential to impact the marine environment in some way there. Coastal defences can impact from changes in kind of wave or sediment processes. So there's no kind of hard and fast line. It's that kind of anything that has the potential to impact on the marine environment.
Okay, thank you. What is your experience regarding marine resource uses between areas bordering or the boundaries within marine spatial plans?
Mm. I'm not really sure about that. As in the estuary, like boundary areas between different plans. There can be some controversy over applications. I think most people will have heard of the Severn tidal barrage, which was proposed, which is proposed from Wales, but will obviously impact England, or will obviously be people in England who have opinions on it. So there is sometimes debate over it, and it can be a controversial subject. But for the majority of developments or activities that are in that area, they do go ahead with kind of agreement or happiness from both sides, really.
Okay, thank you. So you've talked about kind of how far inshore things go and why things need to be considered so far inshore. And someone's asked, what is your view about consulting stakeholders who are far from the coast but have an interest or a stake in what is happening at sea, such as offshore wind?
Yeah, all stakeholders, anyone who wants to be able to comment should be able to comment. So the stakeholder process for marine plan development, but also any individual developments that are going forward in the marine environment, should be open to all stakeholders. The coast and the sea isn't just important to people who live there. Many people have an interest in it, even if they never go there. They have an interest in it. It can contribute to jobs, it can contribute to tourism, it can contribute to so many things that everyone should be able to have an input into what happens there. And within the plan development processes, you should open consultation to all stakeholders, regardless of where they live.
Okay, thank you. I do appreciate the time, but we have one last question, so I want to try and get it in. So do you see a growing role for local municipal governments as plans are developed, and what is their role right now?
Yes, there definitely will be a growing role. So their role at the moment is with these first stages of marine plans that are coming in, when making their decisions, they have to ensure that they consider the marine plan if it is relevant. So if they are looking at consenting a new building on the coast, they now have the responsibility of also considering marine policy and marine plans within that. So that's what their responsibility is now. And I definitely think that there will be an increased role for them, especially if we move more towards subnational planning like they are in Scotland. And then, it will be more for the local area to say what the priorities are for them and kind of input into that process then, definitely.
Okay. Thank you. Hopefully this will be a quick yes answer. Just have one more question pop up. Can stakeholders that are located across the state boundaries be allowed to comment on plans? So someone outside of that boundary.
Yep.
Lovely. Right. Well, we're right up to 4 o'clock. So I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in to listen and for asking questions. And Rachel, thank you so much for your talk and for answering them. It was really useful.